Good morning, everyone. This is update for June 1, 2022, day 98 of the war, end of the date update. In short summary, for those who impatient about the changes of the front line, essentially there are no changes. We're still gonna do walkthrough, but we're gonna spend more time and devote more time towards items that are extremely relevant, specifically economy and Ukrainian infrastructure, some of the strategies of the Russian army, and so on. So let's actually let's discuss first item, which is so-called negotiations, potential for negotiations by both sides. So it turns out what Russia wanted is essentially so how they view negotiations is that Ukraine will sign essentially terms that Russia proposes, which means that Russia will take all of the territories that they captured, and essentially that's it. And there are no sanctions, and all of the sanctions will be lifted against Russia. So that was kind of like their view of negotiations, which as you can understand, there's really not negotiations, but it's just one-sided demands that not going to be met by Ukraine. So all of that was essentially moot point, and the war keeps going. Now let's look what happened today. Russia attacked a tunnel over Carpathian Mountains. That in the Carpathian Mountains, so Ukraine has Carpathian mountains here, and there's obviously railroad that's going through them, and it uses tunnel. It's a 2-kilometer tunnel that essentially connects Ukraine to Slovakia and Hungary here. So they attacked with rockets. It's just another attempt to destroy railroad infrastructure in Ukraine. We don't know effect of those hits, but probably not that much, given that this is obviously just tunnel in the mountains. It's pretty hard to destroy. It doesn't even make sense what they do, because most of the, let's say, fuel and weapon equipment, everything is coming from Poland. And this is Poland here. So this is like probably, we don't know, we don't have exact numbers, but probably 90% of everything comes through Poland at this point. And even gasoline and diesel fuel is now being delivered by Polish state-run oil and gas company called Orlen. So now Ukraine getting all of its needs supplied by the Polish private state-run company. Obviously the needs are not really met because of the sort of poor governance in Ukraine, because there are still shortages of fuel and so on. But what we're saying is that even if Russia destroys this tunnel, it doesn't really affect much overall logistical situation in Ukraine, because most of it comes from different location, not from Slovakia. So it's not very clear to us why they attacking it, but they do. In addition, if you remember, we mentioned this bridge here near Belgorod-Dnestrovsky, through which Ukraine was getting also gasoline and diesel fuel from Romania and potentially other supplies. So it was significantly damaged. It's not totally destroyed, but it's damaged to the point that it's not usable. And it's very interesting that Russia spent about 15 to 20 rockets on it, and only about 7 hit the target or were close enough to the target that eventually they damaged it. It's repairable. It repairs probably will take a month or months and a half. We're not sure if Ukrainian government wants even to do that, because it's going to get hit again in a short order. So it's not even, maybe they still, if it's not critical, they probably will not spend effort repairing it. So that's a quick overview of sort of recent developments in Ukraine. Now let's switch to the Russian economy, because as we mentioned before, Ukrainian economy is essentially dead. So there is not even much to discuss there at this point. So in Russia, what's going on is, so Russia was now officially declared in default on its debt, and we all understand that it was forced default, right? They have money to pay, but essentially they were prevented from paying on that debt. But formally, it's from a legal perspective, it was declared that Russia is in default on paying on its debt. And essentially that means that PIMCO, which is a large fixed income manager in the US, is on the hook for probably a couple $1 billion that they need to pay to some investment banks to cover their, like, not their losses, but the losses of their investors, essentially, who bought Russian state debt. So that's a situation there. And then in Russia itself, the real estate market in essentially free fall, as we discussed. We spoke about the new home sales. Now existing home sales, they dropped 3.5 times, which is, I mean, you can imagine it's pretty huge. Then retail sales dropped 10%. This is recent information from Russian Statistical Bureau, whatever the right name for it. And then there is another big problem for the Russian industry, is that they don't have bearings, and the bearings are very sort of simple, like nothing really special about it. Essentially very, like, primitive saying, but it's being used in any sort of wheels or anything that rotates in machines. So, and what it is, just for those who don't really, who totally kind of not aware what it is, it's just basically like a metal balls that are sort of put between two metal circles, and they allow to, moving parts to rotate in machines, specifically like wheels. And the way it affected how it kind of became known that there is a big problem is that Russia has a large railroad carriages manufacturer that stopped because they don't have bearings, basically. And bearings mostly manufactured by a Swedish company called SKF. So, and which is essentially has a monopoly in the international market for bearings. And so effect of this probably sort of like the first kind of like cannery in a coal mine, but there will be probably many more industrial sort of manufacturers who gonna stop because they don't have bearings. And that also means that you need to replace eventually bearings to maintain equipment that already runs. So it will be harder and harder to maintain existing equipment as well. And not to mention that manufacturing facility had 7,000 workers. So they essentially not laid off, but we don't even know what the terms there, but basically they're not working, they're not producing, there's no value add for the economy. So that's kind of like a little bit more sort of tidbits on the Russian economy. Now let's discuss a couple of sort of questions that were raised by the viewers in the comment section. So one question was, okay, Ukraine is getting these new artillery pieces, right? We mentioned about the scraps from Poland, then potentially this Panzerhaubitze 2000, PH 2000 from Germany and Netherlands, and Ukraine got M777 from the US, and Caesars from France, and then Susanas from Slovakia. So all of this wonderful, excellent equipment. But then the question is like, okay, do Ukraine has UAVs to effectively use that equipment? And the short and specifically long range, right? Short range, okay, that's very clear. Most of the Ukrainian troops, infantry, they're using commercial drones from DJI or Autel. So that's what's being used for the most part. But the long range, and the Ukraine doesn't really have anything there. I mean, it has, probably like 10 or something, but essentially it's really bad situation, and especially if you compare to Russia's situation with Orlan 10, which is exactly that kind of UAV. It's a long-range UAV to support artillery units, and it's extremely important. Even the shells are sort of precise, more or less. They still not like perfectly precise, right? They just still drop within 5 to 25 meters of the target. So you always need to correct your fire, and sort of it's kind of like a feedback loop, right? You need to like, you do the action, you need to look, did you do it right? So the UAV kind of is your eyes for artillery support in this whole system, artillery system. So you always need this long range UAVs, and there's severe lack of those in Ukrainian army. So that's still big open, kind of like big open hole, that ability to use those advanced and good quality weapons is even limited in this way, because there's extreme shortage of the long range UAVs. There are some, and they obviously being used, but it's nothing comparable to Russian army. We discussed this many times, and we're actually still making some materials to show how deadly and this Orlan 10 is, and it's primitive, it's simple, and at the same time it's super deadly and super important on the battlefield. Speaking of the Orlans, we also picked up interesting trend. So actually yesterday, Ukrainian 14th Brigade sort of, how to say, shut down Orlan 10, and this is Orlan 10, as you can see here. And what is interesting, it's actually not military unit. It's basically, this UAV belongs to Russian Ministry for Emergency Situations. So I'm not sure if this is right translation, but basically, if there is some kind of like a catastrophe or something really big, and this is kind of like militarized forces that addressing this catastrophic situation. So probably it would be something in the US terms, that would be probably FEMA. I think that's probably the best kind of comparison. But this is pretty militarized in Russia, and so they obviously also have a lot of these UAVs, and so it seems like there is potentially that there is a shortage of UAVs in Russian military, so they take them from this ministry. This is obviously just one data point. It probably not a trend. We cannot say this is a trend, but it's we will keep sort of observe. We will keep paying attention to this situation to understand maybe there is a shortage of these UAVs, which is obviously a good sign for Ukrainian army, because Russian artillery will become a lot less effective. Because so far, this is the main tool of the war for Russian army, how it makes sort of progress and wins and so forth. And as we mentioned, we initially, based on our information, we know that Russian industry made at least like 3,000 units of this, which should be plenty for the military. So we're surprised that we're seeing this right now, and maybe that really makes us sort of reassess our initial view that Russia has plenty of this, right? Because right now it's going to be harder and harder for them to make these UAVs because of the sanctions, and probably they will still figure out ways to smuggle electronics somehow, but it's probably going to be much harder for them. So that's interesting trend there. There is another topic that we would like to discuss, because it's very important, and it's related to Russian oil and Russian gasoline and diesel fuel and all that, and the sanctions, right? So what happens is, we mentioned that these sanctions are totally misguided, and they don't really solve the problem, right? And here's another specific example how, let's say, how they don't work really. So what happens, Russia is selling its crude oil to India, and yeah, it's a discount, and we mentioned that they sell let's say for about $75 per barrel, and let's say current prices what, like 115, 120, in that ballpark. So you know, there is significant discount, but it's still profitable, as we mentioned many times. So what they do, they basically send it to India. Then so India buys that oil, that crude oil from Russia. Then it processes that crude oil, and there is obviously huge margin. It is extremely profitable for Indian oil refineries. And then what they do, they actually then sell gasoline and diesel fuel to the US. So and then probably also to Europe, but for a fact to the US. So this is kind of like how this thing really doesn't work. And then there's also other stories of how simply Russian crude oil basically being just transferred to other crude oil tankers and being sold back to Europe and US as whatever, like, you know, the crude oil from Persian Gulf, right? So it's really doesn't work even from that perspective, that just like, you know, there's a lot of economic actors who will smuggle, who will try to figure out ways around this approach, because it's not, you know, it goes against the like common sense and economy and how economy functions. So that's where the problem is. That's all for this kind of strategic general questions for today. Let's now actually start looking at the front line in a clockwise fashion, as we always do, and we'll start from the north. Again, there's exchange of artillery fire here along the border, just different locations from time to time. So just things are tense here for sure. But we don't see increase in intensity of the fire on both sides. So now let's look at the situation northeast of Kharkiv, and it's the same basically. Russia wants to preserve this buffer, probably with the idea that it somehow protects Belgorod, which is very close. It's 40 kilometers probably from Ukrainian border, or less, maybe 30. So they would like to keep them, and this is regional center for this Belgorod region, right? So they definitely would like to protect that, and so they trying to maintain this border, trying to push, there's a fighting for like village here, then there was fighting for Ternova. So, but they are not sort of essential fighting. There is it's not a big sort of drive or anything. This is just fight to maintain the buffer. And Ukrainian side, obviously, for sort of political and propaganda reasons, wants to squeeze out Russian troops to just say, okay, we restored the state border and everything's perfect here in this area. So there's like a low intensity fighting that's going on, and probably will continue here in this area generally. Now let's look at what's going on at the Izyum bridgehead and Lyman bridgehead, which essentially is gone right now, but let's still look at it. This is a high view sort of picture here, and actually we will actually answer here one of the sort of questions from one of the viewers who was complaining, sort of kind of saying, oh, you saying that Russian army is exhausted and so on, and they don't have enough troops and stuff like that, and yet they gaining ground and everything in Ukraine. So let us explain how that actually works to make it very clear. So first of all, let's just separate two things: manpower and equipment. Russia has plenty of equipment, and specifically artillery, and huge amounts of ammunition that it spends without even just shoots with abundance, sort of to say, right? So they just shoot at anything anything suspicious, they shoot there. So they don't try to limit use of the shells, artillery shells at all. So so that's one thing. So the heavy weapons they have plenty of, and there's no problem there. They have significant advantage over Ukrainian troops, right? The only segment, small segment that we mentioned, where Ukraine now has sort of maybe slight advantage over Russia, are those self-propelled howitzers, 155 millimeter self-propelled howitzers, right? Like the heavy equipment, which is great, but that's a very tiny segment, about 50 units on both sides, right? So that doesn't really sort of move the needle of the entire war, because there are probably 4,000 pieces of artillery on the Russian side and probably 1,500, 1,800 on the Ukrainian side. So as you can imagine, this is really, drop in the bucket, right? Doesn't really resolve anything. But to be fair, we have to say there is some segment. So basically, Russia dominates in equipment, right? But the manpower has shrunk, and we said this many times. Right now, they started with 200,000 troops when they attacked Ukraine. Right now, like the amount of troops that on the field is probably 160, maybe even pushing to 150. So there is a clear, the army has shrunk. And we're speaking about the sort of battle-ready troops, right? The people who are ready to go into the fight and die, right? Because technically, Russian military is, I think, 900,000 people, right? So just for those who are not very familiar with sort of, call it Soviet military, and because both are, as we mentioned many times, are the sort of, products of the Soviet, it's still Soviet military at large. So usually, typically in Soviet military, at least half of, let's say you see the unit, like half of it is actually not going to be like actual fighting force on the battlefield. It's all going to be all kind of fluff, let's put it this way. Some of it is necessary fluff, totally necessary. Some of it is like fluffy fluff, right? Like totally basically inefficiency, bureaucracy, and just people creating some, sort of let's say positions for themselves, so they're not on the front line. So out of this 450, out of 900, so you really need to understand that the actual sort of fighting kind of capacity is only 450, right? So that's really what it is. And then out of that is some of it is being sort of let's say coming from conscripts. About half of it, maybe a little bit less, actually. And then the rest of it is sort of, call it professional army, where the soldiers are contract soldiers, they're getting paid, so they on the government pay, like formal payroll, right? So that's what this battle ready is referring, like, and that's about 200, let's say 225 to 150,000, right? Out of, so 450 and a little bit, maybe a little bit more, 200, let's say 270, 280, like actually these professional soldiers, right? So out of that, Russia cannot use all of it, in Ukraine, because they still have huge borders and you need to rotate. It's not, you cannot just put everything on the battlefield. So they started with 200. And as we discussed, it shrunk to about 160, but right now to 150, right? So what that really means and how it all played out. So when they had 200, and it was wrong of them, first place, they attacked also everywhere, right? So they attacked Kyiv from east and west. So the amount of troops shrunk, right? So they withdrew from here, so that what they have left, they can still maintain the same density as before, right? So they don't stretch troops. They actually they try to maintain density or even concentrate, because that's the whole kind of point in war about concentrating troops. So what they did, okay, we don't have enough troops. We sort of withdraw from here, right? So that's what they did end of the March, around March 30th time frame. So then they kind of like essentially left with this front line. So they had 200, they let's say have right now 160, right? So the same kind of density that they had at the beginning of the war, right? So now here. So what they do is like, okay, we cannot, that sort of density, and that's probably the best way to think about the war and the front line is the density of the troops, right? So they like, okay, we don't have enough like density. If we sort of spread everywhere, then we really cannot attack anywhere, right? So we need to concentrate troops on the key points where we would like to attack, right? So they essentially took away troops from this area, right? We mentioned this before. They were just like third-rated screening troops, like really forced conscripts from Luhansk and Donetsk region, occupied basically former, well, not former, but actual occupied territories of Ukraine, right? So this is like totally third-rated, not even second-rated troops were here, screening troops. And that's why Ukrainian army was sort of initially successful here, pushing away Russian troops. So they pulled from everywhere, right? They were, there was nothing here going on. They stopped attacking here. There was also on defensive. So everything was pulled to attack, like to concentrate troops, just focus them on this Donbass salient, right? So they were attacking actively here from the north. They a little bit, like not so much actively from the south, right? Like they tried and they see that they're burning those troops without much progress. So that's what's happening. They're like, okay, and this is actually is positive, the Russian command that was also changed at the beginning of April, that they realize, okay, we're burning troops without any success and we don't see sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, let's actually, because now we again don't have enough density, let's then focus on the smaller section of the front line, right? Let's just focus on this, on Severodonetsk salient. So then they can again create, like in the specific local area, they can create again significant advantage over Ukrainian troops, right? So they maneuver, and that's where we're saying that there is a significant improvement. They maneuver with their troops. They don't keep them like, like static, like, okay, this unit here's forever and, nothing really moves. Similar, like in Ukrainian situation, it's more static, as you can see. It's more reactive, like Ukrainian command kind of pulls some of the units from other areas, but only as a reaction to Russian attacks. They don't maneuver on their own with their own plans. They kind of reactive to the Russian actions, basically, right? And there are other reasons why they do it, but just so we understand how both sides act. So, okay, so they were not successful here. So they're like, okay, this is smaller section of the front line. With the remaining troops that we sort of have not burned yet, let's now apply, let's try here, right? Let's try, because it's a shorter front line. We can still create, with the remaining troops, we can create significant advantage over Ukrainian troops here. Okay, so they, that's what they do. They attack here in full force with a huge amount of artillery, fire, with strong airstrikes, and then they bring all of this thermobaric weapons just for impression and stuff like that. So that kind of like allowed them to, again, somewhat succeed, right? So they managed to essentially clear up Lyman bridgehead. They essentially captured Severodonetsk, and they captured Popasna, and sort of that created that salient. Okay, now they got to the point, okay, we burned out even that. So there is now, the dilemma that they're facing is the following. Okay, we burned out all of our troops, so we cannot create significant advantage on any meaningful section of the front line. So that's why we're saying that Russia is approaching pivotal moment where they need to do something, right? Like essentially they cannot keep the situation sort of static, because they are slowly melting ice cube in terms of manpower, not in terms of equipment, in terms of manpower, right? And there are some initial signs that also there are some issues with the equipment, but they probably still far away. But that's what's happening right now. And when we say, you know, melting ice cube, we're talking about battle-ready troops. We're not talking about, you know, conscripts. Russia has immense reserves to, you know, to use conscript and manpower if they want to. You know, they need to declare a formal war, right? So that's where the dilemma is for the Russian leadership, right? Like, okay, we either have to declare some kind of war and start even partial mobilization or whatever, or okay, we don't have battle ready, like sort of this contract soldiers. We don't have enough contract soldiers to continue this war the way it is. That's where it's all getting to, right? So in a way, it's like, okay, they maybe squeezed Ukrainian troops from here and there, but it's a kind of like a Pyrrhic victory, right? You managed to push your enemy strong enough and probably did quite a lot of damage and captured territories, but at the same time, you essentially lost like sort of best of your troops. They exhausted, right? Because this is people who are willing to die. You just the huge difference between like conscript and contract soldier. Contract soldier wants to fight for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, right? Some of them are there for the money, and that's also true. But as a whole, it's still military fighting machine. With conscripts, a lot of them just don't want to fight. They will run away and surrender at the slightest push, you know, against them. And you know, Russian leadership realizes that that's also the problem, right? So they basically essentially spend their most you know, their most strongest, the best troops that they have, right? They're not the best in the world, but relative to what they have, right? And the same, you know, goes true for Ukraine. Ukraine probably also burned, you know, most capable troops that Ukraine had, right? You know, not to mention this Azov regiment and all of these defenders of Mariupol, which were probably the best troops Ukraine had. And it lost it, right? So it lost a lot of this like battle-hardened brigades, meaning like Ukraine didn't lose brigades, but essentially all of those veterans that were fighting there for a long time, majority due to, you know, deaths and high level of you know, death rate, and most of them probably gone. And you have new very fresh people who, you know, sometimes they have training, sometimes they don't really barely have any training, and that's a big problem in Ukrainian army too. So that's kind of like why we're seeing it as getting to some kind of point where both sides are totally exhausted, and we'll see what happens in the next week or two. It will be much more clear. But this is where it's all going, in our opinion. So actually, let's now look at what's going on. Sorry for this kind of long answer, but hopefully it helps people to understand dynamic, because it's not static picture. It's really very dynamic picture, and there are several moving components in it, and you really need to understand how they all move together at the same time, in which direction, and they not all move in the same direction. So it's all, you know, very dynamic system. So again, let's look again at the Izyum bridgehead. Again, everything is stable. The only places where Russian troops are trying to attack is from this village Pasika towards south. We've discussed this many times. This is sort of another attempt to break out from this bridgehead and sort of achieve some kind of success. And also, not sure why they're also attacking from Dovginke. We're not very clear why it's being picked as a place to attack Ukrainian troops here. Maybe there's some tactical consideration here, not clear. Then another place where Russian troops attacking, they finally started attacking Svyatohirsk. So this is a small, tiny town, like probably 15,000 people here, Svyatohirsk. They're attacking from village Yarova, which they captured yesterday. So this is the last sort of effort push to completely wipe out Ukrainian troops on the eastern side of Severodonetsk here and destroy this remnants of Lyman bridgehead, essentially. This is here all cleared out. Ukrainian troops on the western side of Severodonetsk. And here we probably think also, we don't know timing, but not long, and Ukrainian troops will be gone from here as well. Probably at most a week, probably much sooner. So now let's keep going. Let's actually look at the Severodonetsk salient and let's see what's going on there. So the northern side is quiet. Russian troops continued their attacks to squeeze out Ukrainian troops from the town of Severodonetsk. And actually, let's actually see. This is a view from Lysychansk towards Severodonetsk. So this is this large chemical complex here, and this is just residential area down there. So this is just to show, just to give a feeling of like how the western bank of the river is much higher and sort of dominates the eastern bank, and that really creates good defensive position for Ukrainian army. And we just wanted to share, kind of give a feeling of what it is there. So this is kind of like we're just reviewing again what's been going on. So actually we updated. So this was end of May, 3 days ago at this point. Russian troops managed to capture a small portion of town. Then next day they expanded it, right? They essentially started having control about 50 or 60% of the town, and essentially the center part of the town. So you can say that they captured a town formally. But and then yesterday they essentially squeezed Ukrainian troops towards this chemical complex, and the fighting was going on somewhere there. So we saw that Ukrainian troops by today will be out of Severodonetsk. They're still fighting somewhere in this industrial complex. Fighting is still going on, but as we said, they're not gonna last here long, because there is essentially from military point, there's really no point of staying here at this point, right? The town, from even political sort of consideration, right? The town is essentially lost, right? So that's it. There is not much to sort of defend at this point here, and it's pretty good defensive position, as we showed on the western bank of the river. So now let's actually look at what's going on in this Popasna area. Again, the situation is stable, more or less. So no really changes in terms of Russian progress, and it's been stable for past probably at this point 5 days. So that's generally usually a sign that the front line stabilized and Russian troops don't have anything left to continue attacks with. So this is just a bigger picture of the whole front line. This is this Popasna area where they try to kind of create encirclement of Ukrainian troops, but at this point it's stopped. This is whole area that was captured thanks to Wagner group. There's not many sort of Russian troops here. It's essentially a big, we would say, mistake of Ukrainian side to allowing to lose this territory. And then Russian, actually, First Army Corps is attacking here in this area. So far, they didn't have much success, but they keep hammering. This used to be, as we discussed, very quiet section of front line, this one, and then this area till about like Novosvanivka. So it was pretty quiet since the entire war. And so now this section changed completely, and this one is still kind of quiet, with the exception of this area where the Russian troops trying to attack here, but no success so far. So now let's look what's going on straight west of Donetsk. Situation is the same. there were no active attacks, just shelling. So at this point, it again also tells us the initial sign that there is not enough resources to continue attacks, right? And just as a reminder for those who are new, the idea was, okay, let's build this salient here, and then salient from the south, and basically create difficult situation for Ukrainian defenders in Avdiivka, which important industrial town, and force withdrawal from Avdiivka. And there's also very well engineered front line here in front of Avdiivka, which would, trying to break through it would lead to huge number of casualties on the Russian side. So that's another reason why they try to exploit this initial success here that they have around Novobakhmutivka, because it was paid. This success was paid with heavy price by the Russian side, because it was also very well engineered section of front line. So it takes a lot of effort, a lot of casualties to break through it. So now this is the same picture, just a little bit kind of like zoomed in, and this is the area from which they want to build this sort of southern pincer to encircle Avdiivka, or just create a threat, and so that Ukrainian troops withdraw from Avdiivka. And this is this northern one. No changes here, the same situation. Then let's look at the Zaporizhia front line. Again, the same, everything is stable, frozen. This wedge is frozen, just artillery shelling essentially, nothing really changing. This is the big picture of this front line here, and as we mentioned many times, it's built by both sides around strongholds, because the length of the front line is big, the number of troops on both sides is not big, so you don't have enough density, so you kind of creating strongholds, and you fight around strongholds and the roads. So that's kind of how it works here. Now let's go and look at the Kherson bridgehead there. There were some new developments there, but so far it's been quiet, and as we it's super, like, very little information available, but basically our conclusion that Ukrainian attack here that had success only on the first day, where Ukrainian troops managed to penetrate about 10 kilometers into Russian defenses and captured village Bruskinsky. It was stopped. And what is the most interesting part is, and which kind of explains how actually Russian side wins, is it was really stopped mostly by artillery fire and some airstrikes, because this Russian troops here, they're not strong enough, they're not big in anything. So it's really just that Russian artillery, and again going back to that Orlan 10, is totally dominating, and that's a big sort of problem, that sort of strategic problem that Ukrainian army does not know how to deal with right now, in the shape Ukrainian army is, and that not only just lack of, let's say, long-range UAV on Ukrainian side, and probably lack of artillery pieces here, because all of the modern artillery, from what we understand, is in Popasna area, near Izyum area, on Zaporizhia front line, but it's not here. So to our best knowledge, there is no sort of this new pieces of artillery here. It's all old Soviet stuff that Ukrainian army has. Going back to this problem, the bigger problem is the lack of long-range UAV that help to correct the artillery fire for Ukrainian army. That's a bigger problem, and there's obviously problem at their high-level and mid-level command. Quality of the command is simply not there. It's totally poor and lacking, in our opinion. But nevertheless, this was actually, in our opinion, this was actually very clever idea overall, and the way it was executed initially was also clever, because the way it was done is actually Ukrainian army didn't storm Davydiv Brid like like head on, but it actually built pontoon bridge somewhere around here, villages in this, like near this forest, which is super rare thing here in this area. It's like kind of a little bit arid, not like terribly arid, but it's usually like just a plain, like used to be like grass fields, like big huge grass fields, and it's super flat. Like it's like where the flattest is in Ukraine generally, this area, and it was converted to agricultural fields. So the forest is super rare thing, but it's because there is a river, so that's why there is a forest there. And so what they did, they actually built the pontoon bridge. They kind of like moved out of there, and they created a threat for the Russian troops. So they withdrew like somewhere towards Bruskinsky probably, and they blew up the bridge actually here. There used to be bridge, now it's blown by retreating Russian troops. So they moved to Bruskinsky, and then they were pushed towards south of Bruskinsky by advancing Ukrainian troops. And then, you know, Russian side started like really heavy artillery shelling, and so you know everything was stalled, and Ukrainian army had Ukrainian units, and specifically 35th Brigade. Some of the units from there had heavy casualties from artillery fire, and essentially it created almost like internal kind of problems within the unit, where the soldiers were, you know, accusing that like, okay, you're throwing us into attack without, you know, proper preparation and all that stuff. So essentially this whole attack got stalled, and that's it. So like sort of final words, it's probably going to be a small Ukrainian bridgehead on the eastern side of Inholets River for now, unless Russian troops will accumulate enough forces to destroy it. And at this point, giving the whole big picture that we discussed, it doesn't look like they have those forces. So essentially, this is again going to be kind of strange situation where, you know, both sides don't have ability to move forward. So kind of like a positional fighting for now, at least. That's it. Oh, and then we forgot to mention one important thing, which should have been said in general and strategic discussion. Russian military had drills inside of Russia, nuclear war drills, basically, which is very, very, very bad sign in our opinion. And this is bad sign not just for Ukraine, because Russia clearly says that they're sort of the enemy is also US and UK. So this does not pertain just to Ukraine. So that was really because it was about 1,000 soldiers, and was pretty huge drill in preparation for nuclear war. So that's really bad sign overall. So everybody who get ready, because from our experience, people who were not ready, those died first in general. We're not saying, hopefully we're totally wrong on this, and we would be happy to find out that we were super scared, super wrong, and everything is great. But that's clearly not a good sign, let's put this way. Okay, sorry to finish on this note, but it is what it is, and I think it's important that people are aware of the potential threats. Okay, thanks for today, and until tomorrow, bye-bye.